وتعالى وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا وختم أنبياء المرسلين وحبيبنا وسيدنا ووسيلتنا إلى ربنا وسيد المقربين محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وعلينا معهم وفيهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. فقد نوينا التعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على خير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Alhamdulillah. Once again we are honored with the chance to revisit the work of Imam Abu Hamid Muhammad bin Muhammad bin Muhammad bin Ahmad al-Ghazali alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, the revival of the religious sciences, as it's been translated, the revival of the religious sciences, Ihya ulum ad-din. And the word Ihya literally means to give life back to something, right? And Allah, one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Muhyi, the one who gives life, right? So, and the sciences of the religion are sacred sciences, right? They are not just subjects in like a college curriculum or other than that, right? They are sacred sciences. It is knowledge, not something that human beings came up with over years of trial and error or even by deductive reasoning and these things, right? But rather it is divine revelation by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both that which is direct divine revelation like the Quran, right, and that which is less direct, like the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, but still considered revelation. As Allah says, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ, that he does not speak on his own whim, rather it is but revelation revealed, right? Right? And even those sciences which were deduced by non-prophets, right, both men and women, but scholars, right, even that has divine preservation to it, right? Human beings are susceptible to error. We're not prophets and we're not, right, obviously not God, right? But because of the chain of transmission, there's a protection from most of the error, most possible error that human beings could come about. Right, because not only were these great scholars, and this is the part where the university studies kind of breaks off, or not university, but academic kind of look at things without the spiritual aspect, kind of breaks things apart. That we look at the tradition as being something passed down by men or by people, right? Jazakallah khair, Sayyidi. And we forget to realize that those people who the tradition was passed down through, both men and women, right, even though the names of the men are more widely known because women preferred, right? There's one, this is a slight tangent, but there's one great female scholar from the early tradition, from the early Muslims, who wrote, she wrote a whole copy of Sahih al-Bukhari, right? And she says at the end, she says, "Forgive me for any mistakes because I was nursing my child while doing this." So, radiyallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'in. Right? So, but this kind of divorcing the reality that these people who transmitted the religion were of the most pious of the people of the religion. Right? So people who were the most upright, the most truthful, the most trustworthy, the people who would cry in the nights and pray prayers at night while people, right, or sleeping, and still be awake in the morning to take care of the people's needs. Right? People to such an extent of their honesty and trustworthiness that it is narrated that Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala was walking and he heard some people talking about him in the third person. They didn't really know who he was by face, but they heard about him. They said, "We heard that Imam Abu Hanifa prays 500 rakats of voluntary prayer every night," right? But he didn't pray that many rakats. It was an exaggeration from these people. But from that day on, he started praying 500 rakats, right? Just so that they would not be considered lying, right? What kind of people would do that, right? Right? We have to keep that in mind as well when we realize that this religion was preserved not just in the mind, but also in the hearts. As Allah says in the Quran, about the Quran itself, بَلْ هِيَ آيَاتٌ فِي صُدُورِ بَلْ هِيَ آيَاتٌ بَيِّنَاتٌ فِي صُدُورِ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمِ. Rather, they are clear signs in the hearts of those who were given knowledge. Right? Not in the minds, in the hearts of those who were given knowledge. So it's a divine gift of knowledge. Imam al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, he complained to his teacher, al-Waqi'. He said that I accidentally looked at the lower part of the leg of some elder woman, and I forgot 600 hadith. Right? La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. That right there is enough. That part is enough for us to take heed of their greatness. Right? The sensitivity of their hearts to even the ankle of someone. Right? So he said to Waqi', right? And he describes this situation in poetry, actually, Imam Shafi'i. He says, "Shakawtu ila al-Waqi'i su'a hifdhi." I complained to Waqi' what happened to my memory, right? Because of what happened. Right? فَأَرْشَدْنِي إِلَى تَرْكِ الْمَعَاصِي. And he guided me to leave all sin. فإن العلم نور. Right? فإن هذا العلم نور, because this knowledge is light. This is not just information. This is knowledge that is light. وَنُورُ اللَّهِ لَا يُعْطَى لِعَاصِي. And the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not given to the sinner. Right? So there's an essence of divine gift behind it. Right? So there is definitely an aspect of acquisition, for sure. There is the kasb of the knowledge. Right? And then second to that, there's the wahab. There's the divine gift. And this applies to all aspects in religion. That there's an aspect of self-effort and drive and determination, right? But in the end, it's Allah who gives. Right? So Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, I believe, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهِ. Have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah will teach you. Right? Have taqwa of Allah, be mindful of Allah, or fear Allah. Right? Be conscious of Allah, and Allah will teach you. Right? Right, so the preservation of that knowledge, right, it applies to both the outward sciences like the law, right, fiqh, inheritance, right, usually not the most favorite subject, especially if you're not great at math and you learn it in Arabic, but all of that is divinely passed down, right, through that chain. But as well as the inward sciences, and that's what we're focusing on in this book. So the revival, in essence, is the combination of the body and the soul. That's where the life comes from, right? Because just without a soul, if a soul walked in here right now, right, would you say that person's alive? Right? You would just say ghost and run, right? I'd probably be the first one to the car, right? Right? But if a body walked in without a soul, it'd probably be worse. Right? I think they have words for it, mummy or something, or zombie, something like that. Allahu A'lam. Right? So true life is that combination of the two. Right? So when we're seeking sacred knowledge, right, there's an outward to the knowledge. Right? There are rules, there are things we have to do outwardly, right? But there are also inward aspects to it. Right? And this final chapter this final 10th of the book. Final fourth, really covers on that inward aspect, right? And that's really the essence of the book itself, because that's really the life-giving force to our worship, our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Our interactions with people, our purpose in this life, right? The keys to true tranquility and true serenity, right? Regardless of what's going on outwardly. Right? And many people, when they hear of tranquility and these things, they think of, right, apple pies and bright skies and really like a perfect outward situation. But where was that in the Prophet ﷺ's life? Right? Are we saying that he didn't have tranquility? No. Right? Tranquility is a tranquility of the heart. It's an inward aspect, right? Even if there are, right, as they say, tempests, right? This huge waves and storms around us, right? If the heart is focused on one thing, then it's calm, right? And just like as Shakespeare mentions in his sonnet, right? Love is not that which alters when it alterations finds, but or moves or bends with the remover to remove. Rather, it is an ever fixed mark, staring upon tempests. Right? He likens love to a lighthouse, right? Who is standing in the midst of the worst possible tsunami type storm, right? But it's thabit, it's firm, it doesn't move, right? And it just stands there, right? So love is like that; it doesn't change. So when one loves Allah, right? Whatever happens, it's all in love or for love or because of love, right? One's reaction is only love, right? So and we mentioned before, right? And this could get kind of abstract sometimes, that the highest level of spirituality is love, right? And we'll mention, and this directly relates to today's subject about sincerity, right? And we'll take that Imam Ibn Ajiba, Ahmed Ibn Ajiba, who wrote a really beautiful tafsir of the Quran called Al-Bahr al-Madid, which means the vast ocean. And it really is a vast ocean. He talks about that ikhlas has 3 levels, sincerity has 3 levels. All of them are considered sincere, but the highest level is, right, has an obvious distinguishing characteristic. So today we're talking about ikhlas. Last week we talked about intentions, right? And how intentions really, they make the believer actively worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instead of passively worship Allah, right? And just the chapter on intention alone is the biggest cure to what's called an-nisyan, right? Not nisyan, but we'll just say it in English. Being asleep, technically, if you want to translate it literally, right? Because there's a sleep of the body, right? And what happens to the person sleeping, right? They're not aware of their surroundings, right? But there's a sleeping of the heart as well, right? And that sleeping of the heart is probably one of the biggest difficulties that most people have in their religion, right? That their hearts are not awake, that their hearts are not, that their bodies are doing the worship, they're doing the prayers, they're doing the fasting, right? Or even the Hajj, right? They're going with the motions, right? With true sincerity, and there's no doubt in that, right? But they're not feeling that relationship, right? They're not feeling that reciprocated love from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the reward or the closeness, right? Because the heart is not involved yet. Right? And sometimes, one of our blessed teachers, they mentioned this, that for some people, for them, they start with the outward and they reach the heart later, right? That for them, right, they start by applying the Sharia, trying to follow the sacred law as best as they can, try to follow the Prophet ﷺ outwardly as best as possible in their character and their speech, right? And then the heart comes later, right? And for some people, that's the truth, right? But for others, the heart is already there, right? That they have that relationship, right? And then later on, right, they have that desire, they have that sincerity, and which usually manifests in them wanting to learn more, right? And then the practice may come later. So really important that when it comes to matters of spirituality, not to compare yourself to anyone else, right? You go to a class, mashallah, right, this brother, this sister is crying she's so sincere, or this, right? Don't compare yourself to them, right? Everyone has their own path, right? And perhaps Allah is withholding something because it's in your best interest spiritually, right? And perhaps Allah is giving someone something else because they need that to continue, right? And our beloved teacher, Habib Umar, he mentions that sometimes when you worship and you strive hard enough, that Allah will open up some realities, some spiritual realities to you. You might have a sense of serenity in your prayer. You might have a connection with the Quran, right? and then you start to enjoy doing that thing, and then Allah takes it away. Right? Don't think that that taking away is a punishment, right? But rather it's kind of, any of you seen Looney Tunes? Right? You have the carrot and you have the rabbits running on the treadmill and the carrots there, right? It keeps you striving, right? So because he took that away, now you strive even more to get it back, right? And then he gives it back, and then he takes it away, and you strive even more. And then Sayyid Habib Umar, he says, until Allah gives it to you and it becomes your permanent state, right? But sometimes people get despondent and they quit, right? Probably because of a misconception that, oh, maybe Allah is not pleased with me, right? And that's why knowledge is so important, right? Because they're right at the door, right? And if only they knew, they would have continued, right? And then what happens later is that they keep striving, right? Then Allah gives them something way better than the first, right? And then takes it away. And then they strive and He gives it back. And then He takes it away. And then they strive and He gives it back until that becomes their permanent state, until infinity. And the treasures of Allah are never ending, right? So the possibilities of what Allah has to give, right, can never be understood by a human intellect. We can't even fully understand one blessing of Allah, which is Jannah. Right? Let alone, and Jannah just being the outward manifestation of Allah's pleasure, but the inward manifestation, right? Sky's the limit, as they say. But there is no limit. Right? So the key to all of that really goes back to those two things, right? One, none of it's possible without knowledge. Right? None of it's possible without knowledge, right? And that's why ulum ad-din, the whole point of the book is to revive the knowledge. Right? Revive the knowledge. And then the second is that action. Right? There's knowledge coupled with action. One of the great early Muslims, they said that إِن لَمْ يَكُنِ الْعُلَمَاءَ الْعَامِلِينَ أَوْلِيَاءَ اللَّهِ فَلَيْسَ لِلَّهِ وَلِيٌّ. That if those who have knowledge of the sacred tradition and they act upon it, if they're not the awliya of Allah, the elect servants of Allah, then Allah doesn't have elect servants. Right? So right? Learn one thing, practice it. Learn one thing, practice it. And this is why, especially books like this, in older traditions, they wouldn't have a reading of the book. Right? This, making khatmat of Book of Assistance, right? Reading Book of Assistance from beginning to end is a blessing, absolute blessing, right? Right? And just to be able to finish the book is a blessing, right? But the point is not really the reading, right? So in the past, what they would do, and they still do this today in certain places, that they wouldn't tell the student to read the book. They would tell the student, okay, take this book, read one chapter at a time, and don't move to the next chapter until you've applied that chapter to your life. Right? Easier said than done. Right? But it's a really an engaging type of reading. Right? I met a friend, and he was really the reason why we went to study in Yemen. May Allah bless him. Right? And his daughter was the reason I met Ustadha Halima. So you can ask her about that. I told him that I bought the Book of Assistance. I was so happy. I finally got my hands on a copy of it. And he said, good luck. I'm still on the first line. Just crushed me. I'm still on the first line. Right, because he's talking about that second type of reading. Right. First question should come to mind is, what is the first line? Right. He says, عليك يا أخي الحبيب بتقوية اليقين وتحسينه. He says, oh my beloved brother or sister, akh in Arabic has, right? Oh my beloved, right? You have to strengthen your yaqeen. First line, right? Just forget the rest of the page, right? But it really, it's very, because once that practice starts in the series, in the kind of curriculum of that book, the stepping stones of that book, because these books, even the chapter sequences are for a reason. Right? Why did he put ikhlas after intention? Right? There's reasons to it. So by going along with that is as if you're going along with Imam al-Ghazali and he's taking you down the path. right? Whereas just reading it, I mean, there's barakah, there's a lot of learning and you can get from just reading, right? But it's not the same as applying. Right, so when we get to talk to ikhlas, we kind of want to just preface it with that, because ikhlas, right, in essence, is the foundation of the deen. Right? And if you notice that Surah Al-Ikhlas, right, it only has one subject matter. Right? Who can tell me what subject matter Surah Al-Ikhlas is? It's all in the first verse. Allah is one, right? Right, so Surah Ikhlas, in essence, only talks about Allah, whereas other verses you have talks about Allah's greatness, right? You have talk about Jannah as opposed to Jahannam, this world as opposed to the next, right? Shaitan as opposed to the human, right? And then the human, the corrupt, as opposed to the obedient. Right? So you have a lot of these comparisons all throughout the Quran, right? And the beautiful thing about that is that almost everything has a comparison, right? And Allah says that He created everything in pairs, right? And the first thing we think about, right, male, female, right, these kind of things. But even the small things like electricity, right, negative and positives, right? It's really deep, right? But what is the wisdom of creating everything in pairs, right? It's almost as an absolute proof, right, that Allah does not have a pair. Like for you guys, everything is in pairs. But I'm only one. There is no, right? There's no shabih or mithal, right? There's no likeness. So there's no point of comparison. Right? So Imam al-Ghazali, he talks about the virtues of sincerity, right? And he starts with verses. So he says, وَمَا أُمِرُوا, he says from Surah Al-Bayyinah, verse 5, right? وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. Right? And they were only commanded to worship Allah, making their religion sincerely only for Him. Right? And the word deen really, right, is that relationship. Right? The word religion, most people, first thing that comes to their mind when they say religion is rules, unfortunately. Right? But it's not about that. Right? It's not about that. It's that relationship. It's that, right? Ma yadinu bihi. It's one's, right, as they translate, way of life is a good translation, right? Way of life. It's why you do what you do every day. Right? So to make your way of life only for Allah. So this is where the levels of ikhlas come in, right? Because that doesn't only apply to worship. Right? Worship is the lowest level. So he says, Ala lillahi dinun khadis, and this is from Surah Al-Zumar, verse 3, right? Is it, ala means, right, listen up, right? It's a word, I think in old translation they used to say alas, A-L-A-S. Right? Lillahi dinun khalis, only for Allah is the pure way of life. Right? Is the pure way of life, pure meaning sincere. And then the final verse of Surah Al-Kahf, right? فَمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو لِقَاءَ رَبِّهِ, whoever yearns to meet their Lord, then do these following two things, right? فَلْيَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا, then they should do righteous deeds. وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا, and they should not associate in the worship of their Lord anyone else as a partner, right? So there again, there's the action, and then there's the heart, right? Combined. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Right, so what exactly is ikhlas, right? He says, he kind of gives a lengthy, we'll try to summarize it. He says that know for a fact that every single thing, right, it's conceivable that another thing kind of convolute it or adulter it or make it less pure. Whatever you have, it could be coffee, right? You drop vinegar inside, right? It's no longer pure. Right? Anything that's conceivable, right, to be pure, you could also conceive that something enters into it and makes it impure, or makes it less safi, as they say, right? Less pure. I learned the other day that there's no such thing. Right? If you have pure gold, right? What is it, 25 carats, I believe. 25 carats is pure gold. It doesn't hold up. It's too soft. It won't hang. It won't hold up. And 24 karat gold is, you can practically bend it, right? If it's jewelry, right? So it needs to have that mixture to have its strength to it. But this is the absolute opposite of that. Bad example, right? So he says that if it is completely free from any of these adulterating factors, then that is called khalis. That's pure, right? And same thing as the English meaning pure. So he says that any action that is free from any secondary motives or ulterior motives, right? That action is called mukhlas. It's a sincere action, right? And the opposite of ikhlas is to associate in that something else. Okay. Right, so the opposite of ikhlas is shirk, is to commit shirk. And there's levels of shirk as well. Right, so he says that whoever does not have ikhlas is a mushrik. And by linguistic meaning, they're associating things together. Right? But he says that shirk has levels though. He says if we're talking about divine, right, belief in divine oneness and monotheism, right, then the opposite of ikhlas, right, is to associate partners in Allah's divinity, and that's the type of shirk that will take one out of Islam. Right? To say that there's two gods, or that there's two creators, right? These types of things. Right? So that's in regards to one's beliefs in divine oneness. Right, but then he says also, on top of that, right, that shirk, that ascription of partners, right, doesn't necessarily mean polytheism, because somebody might think something has a quality of Allah but not worship it. Right, so polytheism is more broader term. Right? This is associating partners with Allah. Right? He says, وَالْإِخْلَاص وَالْضِدُّهُ يَتَوَارَدَانِ عَلَى الْقَلْبِ. So both sincerity and its opposite, they come and go upon the heart. So it's an act of the heart. It has nothing to do with the actions. Right? Right? So if somebody's going around the Kaaba, we assume that they're a muwahid, a person of tawheed. Right? But if you tap them on the shoulder and say, "What are you doing?" And I'm worshiping the Kaaba. Is that tawheed? No. But the outward does not say belief or no belief. Right? Same thing. Like if somebody made sajda to you right now, would you say that they did shirk? This is a tough question because we know that it's haram. Right? I'm not even close. It's haram, haram, haram. Right? I don't care what your intention is. It's haram. Right? It's completely haram whatsoever, but is it shirk? Right? Poor guy became Muslim yesterday. He reads Surah Yusuf, right? At the end of Surah Yusuf, what happens? Who knows? وَخَرُّوا لَهُ سُجَّدًا. Right? That all of the parents and the brothers, they all made sajda to Yusuf. Right? So in the law of the previous nations, making sajda to a person for the sake of honoring them, not worship, was allowed. So this poor guy, he reads the verse, right? He comes, a lot of respect for the media, right? Hard work that our media, our tech people do. So they make a sajda instead of saying salam, right? Right? Shirk is in the heart. The action's haram. Right? Sorry, we're not from that nation. We're from the nation of Muhammad, and that's not allowed. That was mansukh. That's abrogated. But shirk is an action of the heart. Right? So those people, especially in this time, and that's the reason why I'm mentioning this, is we have some people who are very quick to call mushrik, and this is kafir. Right? Like for instance, somebody comes, they have, right? And I've seen things like this. Right? You have some prayer beads or dhikr beads, right? Kafir. What does this have to do with my iman? Right? Does this have to do with anything with the oneness of Allah? Am I worshipping these things? No. Right? The most you could say, if it has nothing to do with the heart, the most you could say is haram. Right? It has nothing to do with the heart. So the place of belief and sincerity and intentions, right, or disbelief, or even showing off and these types of things, all of it's in the heart. Right? We can't call somebody, oh, you're showing off. You can't do that. We don't know people's hearts. Okay, so he says that it happens to the heart. Right, so he says, right, we talked about last week that intention, right, is really the drive behind why you did something. Right? And responding to that drive, right, is that intention. Right? That's why you did that action. Right? So he says that if the drive for you to do an action, the reason why you did an action is only one reason with no ulterior motives, right, then you are a person of ikhlas. Right? And this is an interesting thing. Right? You have ikhlas in comparison to that thing you're intending to do. Right? So he says that whoever gives charity and their only intention is to seek fame, is that ikhlas? It's a tough question. Imam Ghazali is really interesting read. It is, right? Because he said that, right, it's ikhlas linguistically. You only wanted one thing. You were very sincere in the fact that you wanted fame. Right? There was no ulterior motive. Right? But it's haram. Right? Right? It's haram. Right? And the same thing that if one gave charity and they only wanted closeness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or they only wanted, they're mukhlis. Same thing. Right? They have ikhlas. They're sincere. But that's the sincerity that we were talking about. Right? Even though linguistically that one also didn't have any, right, secondary motives. They only had one. He says, but customarily we only call the second type ikhlas. We don't call that first type ikhlas. Right? That's just confusing. Alright, so he says that if the reason why a person does something is to come closer to Allah, it's for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But secondary motives slip in here and there, and this is common. I don't think that you're the only one that has this. Right? This is very normal, right? And this is where the jihad of the nafs is in fighting away those things and focusing only on Allah. Right? So he says, right, a person wants their main intention is Allah. Right? They're only doing it for Allah, but certain things slip in here and there. And he says, imma min ar-riya, either that those things that slip in are, right, the acknowledgement of creation. What would they say about me? Maybe they'll praise me for this. Right? That's called riya, ostentation. Or another thing that could slip in is some portion that the nafs gets, that one's own self benefits from that. Right? Right? So he says that, right, and this is actually more common than usual. Ramadan, right? Why do we fast for 30 days in Ramadan? Right? Somebody asked you, non-Muslim, again, elevator situation, you have 3 stops to tell them. They say, why do you fast in Ramadan? What's your answer? What's your go-to answer? Can you imagine? There's no wrong answers. I would say for Allah. Allah said to, so we follow, right? But you can say anything. I told my dad once, he's very close to Islam, so please keep him in your du'as. I told him, I said, I can't wait till Ramadan. He said, why? Don't you like eating? Right, so, right, for Allah. Like the main reason is for Allah. Right, but what if Ramadan's coming, like, oh, now a chance for me to lose weight? Secondary, right? Something that slips in, right? And he mentions here that for the sake of health, right? Finally, I can be healthier now, right? It happens. I'm sure it happens more often than not, right? And he says, or the person goes for Hajj, right? Just to travel. They want to see what it looks like in Mecca, right? Right? They want to see right? And part of that could be religious, right? To see what the Prophet ﷺ lived. But part of it could just be another tack on the map, right? Another place to be. So he says that if the intention is to draw nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or to please Allah, or right, all the things that fall under that, but these small little things, right, join with that intention, right, حتى صار الأمر أخف عليه, right, to the extent that the action becomes easier for you to do because of that secondary motive, right? It becomes easier to fast knowing that you get a secondary benefit of, right, losing weight or whatever, right? Right, so that, right, in essence is against, right, ikhlas, but with levels, right? We'll talk about, right, no one is, right, absolute ikhlas, right? We'll talk about one of the pious people of the early Muslims. He had a student who was his assistant as well. He did khidmah, service to the teacher. Was something traditionally the Sahaba did it. They brought his shoes, they brought his siwak, and they would get the water for him, right? And then people, it's kind of a discipline type thing, right? So he used to do this for his Shaykh, Abu Sa'id al-Kharraz, right? And then the Shaykh told him about ikhlas. So he started to not do anything unless he had 100% ikhlas in it, right? To the extent that he no longer served his Shaykh because it was too difficult to do everything with perfect ikhlas. So the Shaykh said, I told you to have ikhlas, right? Not to not do anything, right? Because you don't have ikhlas. Try to get it, that's what I told you to do. Right, so he says that in summary, that every portion, right, health, every secondary motive that's not religious, right, that's worldly, and the nafs inclines to it, the lower self inclines to it, it becomes easier to do. Like, oh, in that case, then I'm okay with it, right? That whether it's a lot or a little, right, that it takes away from the purity of that action, right? It takes away from the purity, either a little bit or a lot. Right, so he says that ikhlas is that your action be free of all of this, be free of it, right? Right, so perfect ikhlas is that there is no other intention except for pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, which is, he says, فَلَا يَكُونُ فِيهِ بَاعِثٌ سِوَاهُ, that there is no ulterior motive whatsoever. وَهَذَا لَا يَتَصَوَّرُ إِلَّا مِنْ مُحِبٍّ مُسْتَغْرِقٍ الْهَمِّ بِالْآخِرَةِ. He said that this is not conceivable for anyone except for those who are ecstatically in love with Allah, and their only concern is akhirah, that they're mustaghriqul ham, that their mind is completely infatuated only on the akhirah. And the interesting thing is that they use the word istighraq. Istighraq means to be kind of literally drowning in something, because gharaq is to drown, right? So that their concerns are only drowning in the akhirah. I mean, because if you're drowning, do you think about anything but water and getting out of it? No, right? You're not thinking about, what do I have for lunch today, right? You're only, right? You have absolute ikhlas when you're drowning, right? And the Prophet said that there will come a time that no one will be saved except for the one who calls upon Allah, the dua of a person who's drowning, right? With that much sincerity and desperateness. Right, so he says that this is really inconceivable for most people, except for the one who is absolutely, completely absorbed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the akhirah, بِحَيْثُ لَمْ يَبْقَى لِحُبِّ الدُّنْيَا فِي قَلْبِ قَرَارٍ, to the extent that there is not a single atom's weight of love of this world in his heart, in her heart. But then he gives us hope. He says, وَعِلَاجُ الْوُصُولِ إِلَى الْإِخْلَاصِ, that the cure that one can take, the treatment that one can use to reach that level, right? Because to beat oneself up for not being at that level right now, right, in essence, right, entails that what they call istisghar, that it's a belittlement of that level, right? The fact that anyone without any discipline or effort or years of striving should already have it. Why don't I have it right now, right? So, right, because these are people who've 50, 60, 70, 80 years never missing salat in jama'ah in the Masjid Nabawi, right? Right? How could we claim to deserve what they have without striving? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives to whoever He wishes. So, and again, it all goes back to that we don't depend on our own efforts. We depend on Allah. We strive, right? But Allah is the causer of all effects. Right? So He says that the treatment to slowly work your way toward that, huwa kasru al-hudud an-nafs, is to slowly try to, it's to slowly take away the motives of the ego, of the self. Right? To stop worrying about what do I get, right? What is my portion of this, right? This relationship with Allah. Right? Because this kind of give and take relationship with Allah is, as Imam Ghazali says elsewhere, it's like the worship of businessmen. Right? Okay, I'll say Subhanallah as long as I get that tree in Jannah. Right? That's a low level, but it's still, right? He says that that's the lower of 3 levels, and they're all saved. Right? So, but that's where if we have to start there, then he says وَقَطْعُ الطَّمْعِ عَنِ الدُّنْيَا, and to remove or sever the desire or the covetousness of worldly things, right? Worldly wants and worldly desires. And that doesn't apply to wanting things in this world. It applies to wanting things only for this world. Not that they're a means to another thing. If somebody wants a nice house so they can be comfortable, worship Allah, raise family, right, have an extra room for guests because the Prophet said to honor guests, right, all of that has an affiliation to Allah, right, to the religion. So it's not worldly completely. If somebody just said, I want a nice house, why? Right? Because the neighbors have one too, right? And I want to be better than them, right? That has nothing to do with the deen, nothing to do, that's worldliness, right? So to remove that desire from the heart. And this happens, you can see this clearly in converts, a lot of converts, but also people who re-engage their religion, that they were, right, raised Muslim, whatever, and then, but there's a point in time where they kind of reverted, right? Some people are really harsh on that convert-revert thing, right? But they re-engage their religion, right? So before they might have posters of Ferraris and these things, but later on, as they progress and they really cultivate that faith, these things become less important to them and less important. And that's how the heart is, right? The more it inclines to the dunya, the less the love of Allah is there. And the more it inclines to the love of Allah, the less the dunya is there. Because they can't be both in the same heart. Right? So to remove that desire for worldly things, things that have nothing to do with Allah, وَتَجَرُّدْ لِلْآخِرَةِ, and to make it solely for the next life, either directly or indirectly by intentions, بِحَيْثُ يَغْرِبُ ذَلِكَ عَلَى الْقَلْبِ, until that becomes the overpowering state of the heart. Right? And he mentioned in the end of the chapter of intentions that if the overpowering state of your heart is your relationship with Allah, it becomes easy to make intentions. It becomes easy to be sincere. Right? And that's not an absolute. Also, there's levels. So the more the religion becomes more, has more central role in your life, the more Allah, right, intentions and sincerity will take over. And he says that all of this treatment, he says, goes back to the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, where one of the Sahaba came and said, Ya Rasulullah, the advices of the religion are so many, right, for me to even think of. I need something practical. Just give me one advice, and don't make it a lot. وَلَا تُكْثِرْ. Don't go overboard for me. Take it easy on me. Right? Look at the sincerity of the Sahaba. Right? He said, قُلْ آمَنْتُ بِاللَّهِ ثُمَّ اسْتَقِمْ. That's all he said. He said, say, I believe in Allah, and then be steadfast on that. Right? That I believe in Allah, and then strive your best. Do your best. Right? So Imam Ghazali explains further. He says, meaning, right, don't worship your own whims. Right? Don't live for your whims and your caprice. Right? Don't live for your ego, for your desires. Right? Don't live except for Allah. Right? Don't worship except for Allah. Don't do, right, except for Allah. وَتَسْتَقِيمُ فِي الْعِبَادَةِ, and try your best to be constant in obeying Him in worship. Right, so he says this, right, is an indication that one should slowly strive to make their focus only onto Allah, right? And there are people in this world that they go about the same day-to-day functions that we do. They talk to people, they answer people's questions, they sit with their parents for a while, right? But at no point whatsoever does their heart ever distracted from Allah. Right? They see every individual that comes up to them as a means to Allah, either through patience or gratitude or guiding them or answer their questions or learning from them, right, out of their humility. Right, so he says, وَهُوَ الْإِخْلَاصُ حَقًّا, to not have any secondary focuses at all, that's the ultimate ikhlas. Shaykh Abu Bakr bin Sadam, alayhi rahmatullah, he said, مَا رَأَيْتُ شَيْئًا, I haven't seen anything except that I saw that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came to my mind before it, during it, or after it. Every single thing. That nothing I've ever dealt with except that I saw Allah before it, during it, or after. Not literally seeing, but that the heart focuses on Allah. Right? And this is a good practice to do. Right? Any new person you meet, remind yourself, right, this could be a way to Allah. Right? And Allah sends people in your life at certain times, right, for you to do this, right? Either for Him to bring you closer to Him, right, or to give you a test, right? That annoying colleague, right? Or that classmate that just gets on your nerves, right? Obviously, we take the means to not cause ourselves harm, right? And severe inconvenience. But if it comes, then know that Allah is the doer of all things, and there's something you could do in that situation that could earn you more closeness to Allah, right? It might not be the most desirable thing to the nafs, right? And that's where, that's the battle right there. Right. So he talks about, right, those secondary factors that come and make our intentions, our sincerity, less pure. He says that if the person only intends the creation and they don't intend Allah at all, right, then they will get sin for that. Right? They are in a state of, that's where they bring upon themselves the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, punishments in the next life, right, and this distancing from the closeness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, and what they mentioned, right, which is, right, really should stir, right, one's fear of Allah, right, what's called at-tarud bin babillah, right, that being cast away from the door, right, because the example is always given that the seeker is the one at the door knocking, right? Imam al-Haddad says, بِوَادِ الْفَضْلِ عَكِفْ فَرْحَمًا رَبِّي عُكُوفِي, oh Allah, I am at I'm making i'tikaf at your door, right? I'm staying at your door, right? So have mercy on my staying here, right? وَبِوَادِ الْفَضْلِ, right? وَبِبَابِ, I forget the first part, right? That I'm standing at the door, right? So allow me to keep staying here and knocking on the door. So every act of worship that we're doing, we're in essence knocking on that door, right? And the door is only open from the inside, right? Right? And that's why Islam is given is sometimes in hadith the example of a house, right? That Islam is like the house. So when we call people, we don't call people to Islam, we call people to the owner of the house. Right? We don't call them to the means. We call them to the ultimate. So if somebody invites you to their house, are they inviting you to four walls? Right? To some furniture? Or are they inviting you to have that communion? Right? So that communion is what we're seeking. Right? The door is the only way through. And that door is the Sharia. The door is the way of the Prophet ﷺ. And that knocking is where the sincerity, that one who's, next week we'll talk about sidq, truthfulness. Right? Really truthful in that claim that one seeks Allah is that they continue to knock. Every chance they get to knock, they knock. Right? Right? That every act of worship in essence is another knock, some harder than others, until Allah opens the door. Right? But the one who doesn't intend Allah at all whatsoever, right? It's that casting away from that door. Get away from my door. Right? And that's what we don't want, right? And that's why Tawbah is so important, right? That even if we do slip up, that Tawbah brings us back to the doorstep, right? And Imam al-Haddad says, وَمَنْ أَكْثَرُ الْعِسْيَانَ مِنْ غَيْرِ تَوْبَةٍ فَذَاكَ طَرِيحٌ فِي فَيَافٍ غَوَايَتِ. Right? That whoever does abundant sin without any Tawbah, with no remorse, no turning back to Allah, no recognition of one's shortcomings, right, then they are cast away in the deserted lands of misguidance. بَعِيدٌ مِنَ الْخَيْرَاتِ. They're far away from all these blessings. حَلَّ بِهِ الْبَلَاءِ. And tribulation befalls them. وَوَاجَهَهُ الْخِذْلَانُ مِنْ كُلِّ وِجْهَةِ. And a type of betrayal, or the opposite of tawfiq, that Allah removes that divine facilitation, right, from all different directions. Right? So we strive our best, right? قُلْ آمَنْتُ بِاللَّهِ. Say we believe in Allah, and then try your best, right? And then Tawbah is just an absolute blessing, right? In the fast, they had to the only way they could make Tawbah is to go to the Prophet of that time and ask them to ask Allah to forgive them, right? And other nations, they would write above their door, this person fornicated, this person, right? What a shame, right? But we don't have that. It's directly to Allah. That remorse completely removes all of that. Right? 50 years of sin and one real sincere remorse, gone. التائب من الذنب كمن لا ذنب له. The hadith of the Prophet, the one who repents from a sin is as if they have no sin. So he says that if they only want other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they only want creation, they only want ego, right? They only want, there's no consideration of Allah, then it's against them. Right? It's not for them, it's against them. And that is a means of attaining the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, as for the one who only wants Allah, right, then that's all of the reward is there. Right? But he says that our whole discussion now is not on those two extremes. Right? That usually extremes are understood. Right? Right? Absolute sincerity is obviously good, and absolute insincerity is obviously bad. But what about the rest of us? Right? That we're trying, right? So there is levels of sincerity in between, and those are the ones that are important to clarify. Right? So he says that the only way to really understand that which is in between those two extremes is the extent to which one side is given preponderance over the other. That one wants Allah, they seeking Allah, they're sincere for Allah, right? But there's secondary motives. So which one is stronger? Right? Is your desire for Allah stronger, or is your motive for that secondary motive taking precedence? Right? So he says that if the religious intention, right, is equal to one's own, right, personal gains and motives, right, then they kind of cancel each other out, and there's no reward, right, nor any sin. They cancel each other out. Right? So if one equally, right, does something for the sake of Allah, they're giving charity for the sake of Allah, they're doing it for Allah, but also, right, for their own personal gains, right, then they cancel each other out. It's as if they didn't give charity. Right? But he says if that secondary consideration, and the riya is, it's translated as showing off, because it comes from the word ru'ya, to see, to make someone else see, right? But it means to do anything for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So to do it for the sake of people watching, to do it for one's own personal gain, right? Anything, right? So if that is the overwhelming out of the two, the more preponderant of the two, right, then that is what leads one toward sin, toward the path of sin, but to a sin that is less severe, right, up to a punishment that's less severe than the one who only did it for that reason, for that second reason. Right? So, but if their desire for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the preponderating factor, and the secondary one is just that, it's just the secondary thing, right? Then they get reward to the extent that their intention for Allah is more than the other. So to that extent they'll get reward. So they won't have the full reward for the action, right? So if they did it 90% for Allah, 10% for themselves, then they have 90% of the reward. Right? And we don't want to get too mathematical with it, because Allah is not a businessman. He's not in the IRS business. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the basis of His lordship over us is mercy. Is mercy. Right? Ar-Rahman ala al-arsh istawa. The most merciful has assumed the throne. Right? There's a reason why Allah used the name the most merciful when talking about assuming the throne over the entire creation. Right? Right? So he gives the shahid of the verse that فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَهُ. Whoever does an atom's weight of good, they will see it. And whoever does an atom's weight of bad, they will see it. Right? Right, so he gives some examples, and these are beneficial. He says, for example, the person who goes for Hajj, right? But they also want to do business, and they're also going there to do business, right? That the scholars, right? They said that his Hajj is sahih, his Hajj is valid, right? And we know that there's a condition of Hajj to have an intention, right? So that does not negate that it's valid. Like for instance, you start your salat for the sake of Allah, then somebody walks in, right? What is the reason why you started the salat in the first place? That person wasn't there. It was for Allah, right? So the salat is valid, right? We're not saying that the prayer is not valid, right? And one will be rewarded for this prayer in and of itself, right? But if they change the quality of the prayer because someone else is watching, then to that extent they won't get that reward, right? So for instance, the only reason I prayed is because for Allah, because I'm slave of Allah, I have to follow the Sharia. I pray my Fajr, or I pray my Dhuhr, right? Someone walks in and I lengthen my Dhuhr. So that's a quality of the prayer. It's an attribute of the prayer. It's secondary. The actual prayer was only done for the sake of Allah, right? The only problem, the problematic thing would be that, right, one would not pray. They're sitting there, I'm not going to pray. Right? And then somebody comes in, right? The best example usually is the future father-in-law, right? He comes in, now I'm going to pray, right? What was the only reason I'm going to pray is because of him. If he wasn't here, I wouldn't pray. That's not sincerity at all. Right? That's opposite of sincerity. So for that, they will not get any reward for that, right? Rather the other aspect, right? But one of the students in Singapore, they asked Habib Muhammad bin Abdullah al-Idrus that how do we stop ourselves from having these secondary things when people walk in the masjid, or we're doing something, we're reading Quran, and then our spouse walks in, or our family member walks in or something. Right? What do we do? He said that if you're praying and this happens to you, or whatever you're doing, he said that picture next to you is a big tin of dirt. It's a big kind of aluminum, you know, those old tins chock full of nuts kind of things. It's full of dirt. Right? And then just think to yourself, would anybody ever show off to a tin of dirt, to an aluminum jar full of dirt? No, right? You'd be a madman, right? Like, wow, that dirt's really going to like this sajda. That's just foolishness, right? So one should remind themselves that all of the creation is from dirt. Just like that dirt can't benefit, that dirt can't harm, just like so-and-so can't benefit, so-and-so can't harm. Right? And their praise means nothing if Allah is not pleased. Right? And their critiques mean nothing if Allah is pleased. Right? Right? So, and that's one of the ways to slowly start to kind of ignore the creation. Right? He gives another example, but there's one thing I wanted to mention, right? That sometimes people, right, they need kind of an affirmation to know that they're doing the right thing, right? And that is not against sincerity, right? You kind of want this encouraging advice or someone to acknowledge, like, okay, you're doing good, keep it going, kind of thing, right? For that extra boost of just to know that you're some sort of affirmation, right? That affirmation, right? We don't seek it out, right? We're not doing our action for that affirmation, but if it comes, it's not against sincerity, right? And one of the proofs of that is that Musa alayhi salam, when he was told to go to Fir'aun, what did he say? He asked for ridda and yusaddiquni. He asked for his brother to come with him as his ridda. Ridda is like his backbone, his supporting person. Yusaddiquni, who can verify that I'm doing the right thing, right? Will we say that Musa is not sincere in his da'wah? No, right? But to know, so if one, for instance, they look up to their teachers, they look up to the Imam of their masjid or some pious people in their locality, right? And they do things, right? They try to do things that person would appreciate, right? Not only for that person, for Allah, and knowing that person knows the path to Allah, right? Or better than oneself, if not absolutely, right? So like the Shaykh, if someone has a Shaykh, right? So to do something so that the Shaykh, right? It's not only for that, right? But to have that is not against sincerity, right? Right. So he gives, in the end, he says that with all that being explained, فَلَا يَنْبَغِي أَن يَتْرُكَ الْعَمْلَ عِنْدَ خَوْفِ الْآفَةِ وَالرِّيَاءِ. He says that no one should ever abandon doing actions just because they're afraid that their intentions are not correct. Right? They should never abandon doing actions because they're afraid of these types of secondary things entering. Right? So, oh no, my heart went to the fact that I'm going to lose weight in Ramadan, I shouldn't fast. No, right? Fast and work on your intention. Right? One of the great scholars of India, he was supposed to go out and give a talk. There's thousands of people ready to listen, right? And he said, I'm not going out. And he said, why? He said, because my heart's not fully there for Allah, right? He says, maybe I will go out and I'll just give a bad talk. Like he was known for his eloquence and his really great speaking abilities, right? So they told him, what are you talking about? Fix your intention and go out and give a great talk like you always do. Right? So that's the essence, because leaving something for other than the sake of Allah is also a type of riya, ostentation, right? And the example of the prayer is good because, so for instance, you're praying, right? Someone walks in, right? Shaitan whispers, oh, make a long sajda, right? Right? So to combat shaitan, you're saying, you know what, I'm going to make a short sajda. No, right? Ikhlas is to forget about shaitan and just do what you were going to do anyway, right? Do what you're going to, not to act for other than Allah, and not to leave something for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Or I'm not going to pray now because people walked in. No. This is where the training ground is, because if we're only alone, right, then how could we ever know if we have this thing, if no one ever walks in while we're praying, right? And we mentioned last week that one of the really good ways to do this, that's the advice has been given by Imam Haddad, Imam, and some of our teachers, to try to do one's best actions in private, right? So that one gets this, starts to feel they say the al-uns, it's translated as intimacy, right? That is, that one can feel the relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in private. Once they attain that, they don't care about anything. Right? If you feel the sweetness of your night prayers with Allah, you won't care who sees you at Fajr. You won't care who sees you in the masjid, right? La ilaha illallah. So he says, he quotes Imam al-Fudayl bin Iyad, right? And Fudayl bin Iyad was an amazing story to read if you can find his biography. He was originally a criminal, an alcoholic, and he heard somebody reciting a verse of the Quran that أَلَمْ يَأْنِ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَن تَخْشَعَ قُلُوبُهُمْ لِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. Is it not time for those who believe that their heart should become humbled in remembrance of Allah? Isn't it about time? What are we waiting for? Right, so Imam al-Fudayl bin Iyad, he said, Al-an, qad ana ya Rabbi. He says, you're right, it is time. And he left his way of life and he changed his life. Right? So they used to call the righteous people of the past, right, those who repented, because they turned their way back. And they would say that if it was because of a Shaykh or a scholar or some other influential person, they would say Taba ala yadi fulan, right? That he did his tawbah at the hands of so and so, right? Meaning they turned back to Allah. So he says that ikhlas, he says about ikhlas, he says that leaving an action for the sake of creation is riya, is showing off, is ostentation, right? And acting for other than for the creation, for the sake of the creation only, is shirk, is associating partners with Allah, right? And ikhlas is that Allah frees you from both of those. Right? Ikhlas is to be freed from both of those. Right, but remember that the shirk that takes one out of Islam is not a shirk in action. It's a shirk in divine oneness, so that one believes that there's two gods or that there's an equal entity to Allah. Right, we're not. Right, no one who believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have that as an issue. The other ones is just the quality of the purity of their actions, and that's where we're at. Right? At the first level, to make our actions on the onset only for Allah. If things enter in afterwards, right, to strive to ignore them, right, and remind oneself that only Allah, right, can reward me, right, for this, and only Allah can benefit me, and only Allah, I'm doing this only for Allah, right? And one should try to be content with the fact that Allah knows, right? So I prayed tahajjud last night, right? Example, someone says, I prayed tahajjud last night, and Allah knows that I did it. To be content with that fact, right, is huge, because what the nafs wants to do, it wants to ruin the action after the fact, right? If only these people knew what I did last night. Last night after my tahajjud prayer, I checked my phone. Right? Why? It's the nafs. It's trying its best, right? It's trying its best, and doing that can possibly, right? It hurts the sincerity of one's actions, right? So one should try to keep it shut, right? There's two things that every believer should try to hide their best, is their sins, right, and their good deeds. They should hide them, right, as best as possible. Obviously, there's considerations. If one is having a lot of difficulty getting out of a sin and they need advice, then to that extent, right? Right, as well as if someone feels that their mentioning of that good deed would encourage someone else, right, then check the intention first and then do it, right? Because that's a higher good deed than to, right? So Abu Sa'id al-Kharaz, he said that, so we mentioned that. I believe we have a few minutes left. Are there any questions about what we covered or in general? If I can just share one thing, just a few sentences. Imam Ahmad ibn Ajiba, Sidi Umar, if there's any questions on there. Imam Ahmad ibn Ajiba, he says that the levels of ikhlas are three. We slightly mentioned in the beginning, but we didn't actually explain it. He says the first level is to worship Allah, right, for the sake of some worldly or otherworldly motive, right, without having any consideration of creation, right? So a worldly motive, like for instance, one reads Surah Waqi'ah so that they have blessings in their wealth. That's a worldly motive, but it's sought from Allah only, right? So they say that if you're going to seek the dunya, seek it from its owner, right? So it's not sought from creation. So it's not the opposite of ikhlas. It's a low level of ikhlas, right? Same thing. I'm reading. Why are you reading Surah Ikhlas? So I have the reward, right? So I have this many trees in Jannah, right? That's a secondary motive, right? He says the second level is to worship Allah only for the akhirah, right? No worldly right? Considerations whatsoever, nothing to benefit you here, right? And the third is to worship Allah just because of one's slavehood to Allah and out of love, right? And that's the highest level, right? That's the highest level, right? To worship Allah only because He deserves to be worshipped. As one of the awliya, he said that if Allah never created Jannah or hellfire, He still deserves to be worshipped, right? So to worship Allah for Jannah, right, is a lower level, right? And to worship Allah out of fear of the fire is still a consideration of creation, right? But may Allah allow us to raise in the ranks of sincerity, right? And to have a heart that is conscious of intentions before actions, and to really strive to keep our hearts focused on Allah in everything that we do, right? Whether it be religious or worldly, whether it be interacting with people, family, close friends, right? Friends or those who are not friendly, right? That we do every action and everything that we do for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we meet Allah while He is pleased with us, right? وصلى الله وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وسلم الحمد لله رب العالمين. Dua request? MashaAllah. Allah yuthabikum. ثبتكم الله على الحق والهدى ويقبضكم على خير ملتي. MashaAllah. Any questions? Yeah, if somebody's in financial difficulty, they read a hadith that if you read Surah Waqi'ah, right, Allah will bless you in your provision. And that is not against sincerity, right? It's not the highest level of sincerity, right? Because there is still, what do I get in it? But it's as we mentioned, that if you're going to seek some worldly thing or any portion for your own self, seek it from Allah, right? Seeking from creation is not, right? And the hadith about those things are true, for sure, right? And they're what they're called mujarrab, right? But they're even more true for the one who does it only for Allah, right? That because the proof that one is doing it for Allah and not only for that thing, is that if that thing does not come, they still do it, right? So, for instance, somebody reads the hadith that whoever wants their lifespan to be have blessing in it and their wealth and these things, then let them join family ties or something, right? So they do it, right? Or they do it for blessing and wealth, right? They go visit their mom, their grandmother, right? Their auntie, all these things, right? And then still the money's not coming, right? I'm not doing it anymore because that's a sign that it was only for that second thing and not for Allah plus that thing. Right? And when we look at the hadith of virtues, we should see them in the eye of that knocking on the door. Right? That those things are really a bonus. Right? And the greater the mentioning of reward, in essence, it's just another way. Those rewards are true, right? We're not like explaining that away, right? But you can just consider it, that means Allah loves it more. Right, this one you get a tree in Jannah, this one you get a whole palace in Jannah. Right? That means Allah loves this more than that. Right? So that's a harder knock than this, but they're both good enough. Right? Right? But to seek it from Allah is not against sincerity. Right? Actually, that's true servanthood, right? To go to Allah knowing that only Allah can help. But it's not the highest level. It's not the highest level. Any other questions? Yeah? Well, I mean, it really goes back to the heart more than anything else, than what reading or doing this action or that action. Right? If the heart is focused on Allah, that Allah can help me in this situation, right? That my solution lies with Allah only, right? Then no matter what you do, you're good. Right? Right? The problem, like the mentioning of that a person would leave it, right, is they only did it because of that bonus, because of that virtue. Right? But as we mentioned, to seek assistance from Allah, whether it be in worldly things or in religious things, is what we're commanded to do. Because right, Allah says, وَإِن يَنْصُرْكُمُ اللَّهُ فَلَا غَالِبَ لَكُمْ. If Allah helps you, no one can overtake you. That applies to everything. That applies to everything. Right? And same thing with dua. Right? If you ask, like asking from Allah is not an objection to Allah's decree. Right? But the problem with, like, financially, right, many people, that it affects the heart. Right? And it's different. And the Prophet said, كَادَ الْفَقْرُ أَن يَكُونَ كُفْرًا, that sometimes poverty can draw a person to be ungrateful. Right? That it affects the heart to the extent that one starts to worry whether Allah is actually going to provide them or not, right? Where Allah guaranteed it, right? Or a person starts to ascribe themselves as being the one who provides, or some other person is supposed to help, like, oh, they didn't give me, that's why. No, only Allah is the only giver. Right? So in times of difficulty, it's really important to focus on the heart and remind oneself of their beliefs. Right? And those are great means of doing that, to go to Allah through those doors that the Prophet told us about. Like giving charity, again, right? It's the opposite of what the aql would say. Like, I need money, therefore let me give money. It doesn't add up. Right? That's why, right, we believe in the unseen. There's a blessing in it. Right? Right? So all of the means of, right, of expansion and wealth, right, that the Prophet taught, right, are the doors to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Right? One last question, and we have to stop for Maghrib. جزاكم الله خير. الفاتحة بنقول وقل الله صلح لهنا الله يخشاني برحمة مغفور وعلى علينا وبركات هذه الدروس يزكي بها النفوس يقربنا من ربنا القدوس ويجعلها فرحة لسيدنا شيخنا حبيب عمران حفيظ وجميع الشيوخ، وأن الله يجعله سببا لتفريج المسلمين بسر الفاتحة إلى حضرة النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. الفاتحة. جزاكم الله خير. Sure. That's a really good question. The Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ taught the Sahaba, and you would see this in their lives, that whatever they started, they would never leave it. Right? And really, that consistency is where the doors are. Right? And Imam Ghazali, he says that, like, remembering Allah, for example, right, dhikr of Allah, that it only benefits in its fullest way if it's done consistently with presence of heart. Consistently with presence, and you can apply that to every voluntary act of worship, right? But there's also, so if one has a daily portion of something, they should never leave it, right? That's why keep it small at first, right? One of the Sahaba, he said to the Prophet that I want to fast every day. He said no, right? He said, oh, the Prophet said fast Mondays and Thursdays. He said, I can do more than that. He said, okay, then 3 days a week, 3 days a month on top of. He said, I can do more than that. And so he said the fasting of Dawood, right, every other day. And he says at the end of the hadith that I grew old and I wish I took his advice. Which that means that until he was old, he did every other day. He never left it, right? So whatever that minimum portion is, never to leave it. But if one finished their minimum portion of dhikr, right, they can still do dhikr, right? They can do more than that, like a go-to, like la ilaha illallah or something simple, right? And at that point, in that excess, right, if one feels more effect in Quran as opposed to that, then to do the Quran, right? Because the nafs gets bored, right? The soul gets bored, right? So, and that's why there's an expansive range of different worships, right? So to go from one to another, but not in the minimums. So if you set for yourself a daily portion of Quran, or a daily amount of dhikr, right, or a daily amount of prayers, and to stick to that. In the excess, then you can choose whatever you feel your heart is more engaged in, right? Sure. That's why they mention it, to have a minimum of every good deed every day. Right? In Tarim, they would give charity every morning. And they have like an organization that you give them every month, and each morning they'll give on your behalf until your money's run out, and then you refill it. So that every day you have your portion of charity. Every day you have your portion of, right, in duha, or an extra 2 rakats, or here and there. Right, a daily portion of Quran, right, seeking sacred knowledge as well, right, to the extent that one can, right, and aiming for quality over quantity. Barakallahu feekum.